was my age. When I started Mentor, I was 23 years old, and I hopped on a meeting about a youth-led advocacy guide and project. And so in that meeting, it was literally my second week there, and we all started talking about this guide and how to really advocate for young people. And the ages of the folks that we were primarily discussing were 16 to 24. And so at the time I was 23. And I think that really gave me the opportunity to kind of step up in my position. And I worked as a project manager for this guide. And I think just living as a young person, like in this society, is really what encouraged me to start like working in the youth development field in general, just because I don't feel as far removed from it. So it's kind of like it's my everyday life. So it's pretty cool to have that balance between experiencing things and also working to improve it.
Thank you for that. Chloe, what got you involved in youth leadership?
Well, it's interesting because I have been working in child development field for about 15 years now. And I started with Richmond Hill, which is an ecumenical retreat center, doing their summer programming when I was 18. And it's just interesting when you work with youth to see their vibrancy and to see how intelligent they are and how they really know what they need for themselves, really just push me to continue in this field and create those opportunities for youth so that their voices can be heard and that they feel empowered. A lot of things that we're finding right now is that youth don't feel empowered to make decisions, especially after they're graduating high school, or don't feel empowered to be able to maybe stand up to the bully in school or, you know, not succumb to peer pressure. So putting them in leadership positions helps give them that confidence to be able to navigate the world.
That's really great. So I'm hearing you saying that it's important for us to make sure that youth leaders are feeling empowered and that they have a sense of sort of like ownership over the programs and the things that we're doing. Is that something with your organizations, the two of you, is that something that was always in place, or was it something that you kind of brought to the table? What's the history of youth leadership in your respective roles? And Chloe, I'm going to go with you first, and then we'll go to Amaris.
Sure. So I worked in a lot of nonprofit organizations that were specifically focused on youth development. And so a lot of them were kind of hitting on topics such as mental health and kind of creating mentorship programs so that they would have, I think the research shows that at least one caring adult makes an impact in a child's life. Sometimes it's more, I always say working with kids, sometimes it's more working with the adults than working with the actual students, because you have to convince leadership that there is a need, and you have to create data to support that need as well. And so sometimes it has been really organic to create these opportunities and create these leadership roles for students, but sometimes you kind of have to push and gather some data and let leadership know why this is important. So it's kind of a both and on my end.
Great, thanks. Amaris.
Yeah, so I would say that here at Mentor National, our main focus is on mentoring programs versus just directly working with the young people. Just the nature of our organization, we don't necessarily do that, but we were presented with a unique opportunity from the City Foundation, and that grant that we received was specifically for youth advocacy. And so when thinking about that, we had to really brainstorm on how we're going to ensure that young people's voice plays a role in the work that we do. And so originally this was just a youth-led advocacy guide. And the idea was to create a guide that really helped programs, funders, teachers, mentors, parents to understand how to build spaces for authentic youth leadership and advocacy. And when we started working on this project and we hired a youth advisory committee, that is when we realized the real need for us to amplify youth voices more in our work. Youth voice has always been a priority for us, but most of us at Mentor National are more skilled with programmatic things, not involving youth, because we really want to just be resources for those direct service programs. So as we were continuing to have these conversations, some of the young people brought up, hey, this guide is great, but this guide is really geared towards adults. And we really want to show our voice in other ways. And so that is how we birthed a youth advocacy magazine out of that. And then from that program, it led to another program at Mentor National, where we led an ambassadors program and worked with 10 young people. And they worked in cohorts, and every 9 weeks, they went to different departments of Mentor National to learn the ins and outs of nonprofit work. So I would say that just inherently, we were not doing any youth voice work. But as we got these programs started, I think across the board, we really just saw how much we needed youth voice. And now we can really see throughout our departments and teams at Mentor National, how we're finding more creative ways to implement youth voice. So that could look like on our social media now, we work with more young people to create videos for campaigns that we're talking about. And the newsletter for the advocacy team, we uplift stories from the Youth-Led Advocacy Guide, from the Youth Advocacy Magazine, and we actively search for young people to tell their own stories. So I think that it was really a unique opportunity for our organization, but just in a short amount of time, we've really seen the fruits of that labor and how impactful it is to really elevate youth voice.
It's really fascinating to me that you say that you're listening to the voice of the youth when you're doing your guide, and that one of the things that came up was the fact that the adults that were in the space weren't necessarily connected to the actual needs of the youth. So my question is kind of a follow-up to that. I'm going to ask you, Chloe, and then Amaris, I'd love for you to answer this. What is adultism, and how does that get in the way of the way that we sponsor youth leadership programs? Can you talk to us a little bit about what adultism is and how it can kind of get in the way of our goals in this arena? Chloe, can you start with that?
Well, adultism, that's a new ism that I just heard for the first time today, but I think I understand what you're saying in terms of adults kind of putting what they think that they need forward instead of listening to youth and gaining their perspective. That is, I think it's inherent in our culture. I think that we don't really give youth the opportunity. We tend to have a lot of conversations about them and around them and not with them. And that's something through a project that I recently did for Teen Summit. We put out a survey to students across the region to get their feedback about what they see change in their community looks like, what they see support for mental health looks like, what resources do they need, and what way do they receive? Is it social media that they get those resources? Just what is the accessibility like? And so I'm currently putting together some of the information that we received from the Teen Summit, which went extremely well. It was at the Richmond Convention Center, where youth voice was all we were focused on. And we had to pre-teach to the adults that today is a day for students to be able to be heard. We're not trying to push any agendas on them. We're not trying to force or turn the conversation a certain way. We are literally there to listen. And the outcome really was spectacular when we took a step back and actually listened to what they were saying. And I'm happy to, once all that information comes together, send that out to the group as well. But that was one of the big things. We not only had to focus on students' voice being heard, but pre-teaching to adults how to just listen. And that's hard because as adults and mentors and support staff, we want to solve problems. We want to tackle whatever challenges they have, especially when you kind of are working in the field and hearing some of the stories that students are going through. As adults that support students, we're passionate about helping them. But a big piece of that is just taking a back seat and really listening to what they need and what they think would make them the most successful.
Thank you so much for that. That's very helpful and clear. Amaris, do you want to add to that in any way, since you had a specific instance where the students spoke clearly to you that, hey, our voices are not being heard? How do you kind of frame adultism in your work and combat that?
Right. So I think, that it makes sense for, adults to feel like, well, we have to support these young people. So let's do this work. But I think that one of the key components that I found missing in some of our meetings when we didn't have the young people was that, hey, we are advocating for young people, but we need to really teach them and equip them with the tools to advocate for themselves. And I think that's, you know, a lot of adults have good intentions with advocating for youth, but there has to be a way for us to pass that mic to them and let them speak for themselves. So I think as we hired the young people, we just really saw, like in a lot of the meetings that we had, that all of the ideas that we thought were great and represented young people, they were like, actually, it doesn't. And so I think that was a really great like learning curve for all of us inside of that room to really just elevate those voices. And I also think that it seemed kind of hypocritical for us to create a whole youth-led advocacy guide and then not let young people lead in these instances. So what that looked like in the day-to-day was, instead of saying, you know, oh, you don't have the ability to do this. Well, maybe there's some tools that you're lacking and you don't have the access to do this. So instead, we kind of had to reframe our minds. And especially when we work with the young people as youth editors for our magazine, we hired a lead content writer, and she'd work with them one-on-one to really develop their stories, because a lot of the times they had fantastic stories, but, you know, they didn't go to workshops like some of us, or they aren't, you know, don't have graduate degrees. And so there's a lot of key components that may be missing, but that passion is still there. So we really had to work on uplifting that passion. But I also think that it was most definitely important for us to do some introspection. And this is where even writing the guide came into play for us. And it allowed us in this process to look at what we're doing in real time, because we have to have adequate training. We can't just go into a room and say, hey, I love young people, so let me work with them. There is a specific way to work with young people, and it's also a learning process. And it varies depending on where you are, how old the young people are, and also their individual and specific situations and experiences. So I think that one big takeaway for us was to not, typically when we're experts in our field, we go into meetings, go into presentations, and we're like, we know everything. We know all of this work. This is what we do. We wake up and we breathe this work all of the time. But I think the most humbling thing was to realize when we're in front of the young people that they say, actually, your ideas do not make a lot of sense to us. And so I really think that it's just really important for adults to realize that what we're supposed to do, or what we should be encouraged to do, is help and assist, and to give those tools and train and equip young people instead of speaking for them, giving them the opportunities to speak for themselves.
That's really helpful. So I'm hearing a couple of themes that I want to draw out here based on your answer, Amaris, as we kind of move towards our Q&A. But I'm hearing you talk a lot about, I heard some themes there with like growth mindset, some asset-based strategies, but we know that strategy is one thing, but what we really have to start with is this sort of developing of trust. And clearly the students had enough trust with you all to come and tell you that, hey, your programs are not really serving us. And so how can adults, as they enter into these youth leadership relationships, and as they start to try to implement this in their programs, what are some ways they can, best practices in terms of just developing organic relationships with youth? How would you advise mentors and caring adults to begin to develop that trust that's so important and key to kind of getting to these strategies of growth mindset and things like that? Chloe, I'm going to ask you to answer that. How can we help some of these program partners and mentors? How do we help them develop organic relationships? And then Amaris, I'm going to have you follow up.
Well, I want to piggyback off Amaris because she mentioned that adults should go through training before they get in front of youth. And I think that's a big piece. I think you may have the heart to work with youth and you really, like that field, but it does take a little bit of a nuanced approach. And so training is really beneficial in just being able to know how to navigate certain situations, especially as a mentor. And I think that after that, it's really important for adults to show up as their authentic selves. I think we kind of try to tap into mommy mode or dad mode or, mentor mode, instead of just coming to the table and saying, hey, I understand what you're going through. My experience may have not been specifically like yours, but it may have been similar. Here are some of the tools that I use to get through these situations. Here are some of the people that I reached out to in a very authentic way. I think kids have a really good detector on people who are not genuine and authentic, and can kind of, that impacts the way that they take your information in, right? And that impacts the way that they listen to you or use the information that you're giving them moving forward. A lot of that too is some students won't be as forthcoming or responsive. And so really being willing to take the time to build that relationship. I have a specific story about a student I was working with when I was working with communities in schools that right off the bat, he was like, I do not like you. I don't like the fact that you come to my classroom and you give me things. I just don't like you. And I was like, that's okay. You don't have to like me, but I'm here to help you whenever you need me to help you. So it took a year to build a relationship with that student, because of all the things that he was going through at home and because he just wasn't used to having trusting adults to be able to talk to. And so by the end of the year, we ended up every Thursday, if he went to all his classes and completed his work, he was able to play Uno with me before the bell rang, before he had to get on the bus. And so it just shows how that relationship came full circle because he was not messing with me at first. But you have to be willing to take the time to build those relationships, and be patient with students who especially may be going through something at home that you just don't know the impact of how that impacts them in school. So I would say training, showing up as your authentic self, and patience.
Oh, so good and helpful. Thank you so much. Amaris, you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, I would just like to add that, as we journey through school, we have often seen how many times we've had to like really reread material, and that a lot of our learning assignments were to read this book, go over this chapter, take notes on this thing. So I also think that it's very important to ensure that we're consuming some quality resources on, working with young people. So one thing that we really implemented in our youth-led advocacy guide, we have some sections that talk about reflection for adults, learning and researching, because, once you get all of this information, that's great, but we want to know how you're going to put that into action. And so I'm just going to drop in the chat the resources for becoming a better mentor, and that strategy to be there for young people. And we most definitely cite this all throughout the work that we do, just so that as we are, talking about really engaging youth and allowing them to have a spotlight in the work that they're doing or the work that they want to achieve, it's important to, again, do that self-reflection to learn how to become a better mentor for young people. So I'm dropping that in the chat. And then I also just want to drop in the growth mindset toolkit. Guide their mentees, and also cultivating that space for positive decision making, self-reflection, and other things to really implement a growth mindset. So I think that it is important to go to workshops, to get that supplemental learning, to be there in person and work with young people. But I also think that just like as we do our own work, we know how important it is to research and to study and to take notes so that we can have some concrete ways to put those thoughts into action. So let me drop this in the chat as well.
Thank you so much for those tools. They're great tools. I really appreciate that. This is going to be my last question, and I'm going to open it up for those of us who are gathered. How can we assist youth who aren't comfortable stepping into leadership? How can we help them find the confidence to take leadership opportunities and to stay in leadership roles? Amaris, I'm going to start with you this time, and then we'll go to Chloe to close that one out.
So throughout the Youth-Led Advocacy Guide, the young people that we worked up came up with the theme of power. And I remember being in the meeting when they said they want a whole guide about power. And I'm like, how is that going to make any sense? But now I see, because our whole guide is about power. So when we talk about power throughout the guide, we really talk about how to redistribute power to young people. And that starts off by understanding the history of power, what institutional power looks like, where this power comes from, and then moving on to like internal power and community power, collective power, and things of that nature. So I think that, you know, when young people are not comfortable you know, leading or even or being in an authentic space to lead, a lot of it has to do with the fact that they do not feel powerful. And one way to really ensure that young people feel powerful is to understand where power comes from in the first place. A lot of times when we work with, you know, certain groups, I think we sometimes forget that even if we are in marginalized communities ourselves, that we still hold a level of power when we're discussing things with young people. So it's important for us to check our privilege as adults and see, you know, well, how am I showing up in this space? Because if you're not showing up in a space authentically, it is going to be very unlikely for young people to be authentic with you. And so, you know, I really love that Chloe talked about time, and that is most definitely important. Time plays a huge factor in this, but I think it's also important to recognize the power that you have. And as you work with these young people, the more you give them the opportunity to redistribute that, you give them the opportunity to have power by redistributing your own power, even in smaller situations, that will prepare them over time to do that. So instead of you know, talking to them and giving blatant direction, starting with some questions to lead them to the answer versus just giving them the answer, will start to give them that power and authority even in small spaces. And then we can see how that transforms when they start to work with bigger groups or in different situations.
I just love that so much, that redistributing power, because I've never used that language before, but that's exactly what it is. And I think a part of that too is breaking leadership down into maybe bite-sized pieces. We always talk about, you know, when you get to a goal, there's steps to get to your goal. So to get them to leadership, asking them those questions of maybe what they want to work on, whether that be their own relationship building, do they need assistance with adapting or agility? Maybe they need some tips on how to be more resilient or to how to critically think through a situation. So all of those little skills that build up to leadership, we kind of have to find out what they feel like they need and then support them through those things. And that could be, you know, as simple as just how do I get motivated to do my schoolwork? Like how do I, so that I can be an example to my little brother? So it could be really small things, but we have to make it tangible and we have to make it feel like it's accessible and it's reachable for students instead of making leadership feel like this big incumbent thing that they'll never be able to get to and feel overwhelmed by it. And I think that's something, you know, not just for students, but for all of us. You know, we all have goals and we all have to break it into bite-sized pieces to get to those goals, which we're learning as adults, but to equip students and young people with these skills early on is really going to set them up for success, no matter what level they're on, even if they are natural leaders. And, you know, a lot of our natural leaders tend to be the students who get pulled out of class because they talk too much or, you know, what have you. So you got to work with the student and really see and build those relationships so that you can know as their mentor where they need to be built up.
Yes, I love that, the emphasis on that youth spark and being able to call that out and name it for them. So now we're going to go ahead and enter into our Q&A. If you will have any questions for our panelists, you can go ahead and either come off of mute or paste your question in the chat. We'll do our Q&A before we close out here.
Okay, I'm not going to be shy. We talked a little bit about adultism, but I hear several young people always talking about adulting. Why do we tell them they need to be adulting? And what does that look like as it relates to any type of self-agency if we're telling them what we believe? Now, I could be in that group, so I'll just leave it there. Anyone?
I could go first. I think this term adulting, and I'm guilty of using it myself, because it's those days where, you have to go get an inspection, and then you have to like pay your copays, and then you have to, do all the things. And I think when students hear us talk about it, I don't know, that's a good question. How do they feel when we talk about adulting, or they, talk about, I don't feel like adulting today. But it's really the responsibilities that we have as humans and have as citizens and have as, to make sure that we are in good standing with ourselves. We have to teach them those skills. And I think we have to teach them that life is not going to always be easy, and it's not always going to be fun, and it's not always going to be engaging. And sometimes you do have to put your head down and grind it out and, take care of business. But we have to teach them how to do those things, because when they get out into the real world, it's going to be so overwhelming for them to do all of the things, right? Like, just putting my business out there real quick. I haven't done my taxes yet. It has been looming in the back of my brain for weeks. For weeks. I'm like, okay, tomorrow's the day I'm going to do my taxes. But just things like that probably, that feels overwhelming to me. So I can't imagine how it feels to a student. We're telling them, oh, by the way, you're going to graduate, and now you have all of these adult things to do, without really giving them any support or tools or guidance. We don't, not to get on my school soapbox, but we don't, students don't know how to manage a budget coming out of high school, especially when it comes to student loans and things like that. They really may not know how to navigate those things, filling out forms and filling out applications. We just are finishing up a workforce bridge program with some of our students in a high school nearby, LC Bird, who had the opportunity 2 weeks ago to come shadow with some of our government county employees. And it was just so amazing to see how much information that they just were taking in and didn't know. I didn't know that this job had multiple different facets, and I didn't know that I could start out in this position and then grow to this position. There's just so many things that I think we need to keep teaching our students so that adulting can feel a little bit more tangible when they leave high school. I hope I answered your question.
I would just add in that I think we expect young people to grow up so fast and all at once. Chloe was really talking about like teaching young people things before they have to like get to that point. And I think that's so important, because like I graduated college like 2 years ago, undergrad, and then all of a sudden I'm like working with a budget for my job, and I'm like, I don't even know how to manage my own budget. And while some people may be like, oh, look at all of this great work, I'm like, well, I really wish I was a little bit more prepared, because just because young people are doing stuff does not mean that they're having a fun time doing it. So I think it is most definitely important to encourage them, but not in a way where you're like, oh, I have to pay all these bills, you don't want to be an adult, it's going to be so hard. But instead, yeah, being an adult can be very difficult. It's also difficult being a young person too. So I think really like understanding that and guiding young people into things, because it is a culture shock. Like I know how like I could barely get to my 11 a.m. classes in undergrad, and now all of a sudden I have to be at work at 9 a.m. every single day. I'm like, what is this? So I think it's just really important to like let young people know these are some challenges that will come up, but how can we properly prepare for that? Like, I wish someone told me like in high school, like, hey, when you get out into the quote unquote real world, like this is how things may look. So here are some small steps to prepare you for that, instead of just like let me throw you out into the wolves and you'll figure it out. And they probably will figure it out. But I think that one thing that we can think about is like how we, I would have rather figured that out slowly and having some more support versus, having to do things very quickly. Because I think it makes us grow up a little bit too fast. And so I think that it's most definitely important to adults and to do like adult like things, but in smaller steps so that you're not always as overwhelmed.
That's really great. That's really great. Any more questions for our panelists?
I thought Sean had his hand up. It's a quiet group this morning. Did you have a question, Sean?
Well, I did want to also, Amaris mentioned, adulting is hard, but being a young person is also very hard. And so I think we also have to acknowledge that and not make it seem, I think once you get to adult, you're like, oh man, I miss being a young person. You didn't have to pay any bills. You didn't have to do this. You didn't have to do that. But imagine, I tried to like put myself in their shoes and imagine like not knowing nothing. Like they don't know how to navigate these things. And then all of a sudden as adults, we're like, oh, you got to think about college. Oh, you got to think about this. Oh, you got to fill out this application. How overwhelming is that when you've just literally never done it before? So I think a piece of that too is helping them find their own grace, that they don't have to do everything, like Amaris said, all at once, and that it's okay to be a young person and it's okay to not know and it's okay to make mistakes. I think that's a big piece of it too, because I think that's where shame comes in, where students feel shameful for not knowing when they weren't supposed to know yet. They're supposed to learn and grow, and that it's okay to learn and grow at their own pace.
Thank you, Chloe. There is a question in the chat. How can we leverage near-peer mentoring relationships to support youth leadership? I work with a team of folks who support college students to do mentoring with area programs. I don't want those college students to be one more person telling younger people what to do. How can our college students support organizational youth leadership goals without getting in the way of those goals? And that's from Kim Dean Anderson. Let me know if I did not ask it correctly. But either one of you can go ahead and take that question.
Well, I would just jump in and say that I think it's important for them to also have some type of training. I know that it could be very challenging, especially like as I'm the oldest of 5. And so even with my younger sisters who are like 3, 6, 9, whatever years younger than me, they're kind of like, hey, this is great. Love you. Great information. But like, you're literally almost my age. I don't want to hear that. And so I think it's important to, also consider some training for college students on how to work with people who are a little bit younger with them, because they are, at different stages of life. And I know that when I was in college, I was probably like, oh, I have all the answers to give to these high school and middle school students. So I think it just takes like a little bit of time and training, and maybe to like, do some workshops with them on how to really have better communications and relationships with people who are just a little bit younger than them. I think it takes some skills, maybe.
No, I 100% agree with you. It does take a skill set. I think it can go both ways. Either, college students come in and, they're role models and the students will listen to them, or they're like, you're a little too close to my age and maybe you don't know what you're talking about. But I think that is where the training comes in. And just making sure that the people that are mentoring come in really with the lens that they also don't know it all either. And I guess that's where the training comes in. Like you said, I remember as a college student, oh, I have all the information, I have all the things, but really I'm still in my growing in my learning process. And then it's important for those college students to have mentors too. So it's a trickle down effect.
I can jump in too, actually, because I work with college.
Please.
One thing I would say it would be to have the younger folks come ready with questions. I think a lot of times college students will sometimes regurgitate what they think someone needs to hear. But I think if someone really presses them or asks them a very clear question, they have to kind of think about what they would do in a situation or how they rose to the occasion of something. And so I think one of the ways to do that is to let the ownership kind of go both ways and let it be reciprocal, and have some questions for both folks to ask one another. That kind of will create a little bit of trust, I think, or that's what I've seen work. Any other questions? Just because I love college students, so I love talking about that. But are there any other questions before we toss it to Emma?
Well, I actually have a question, if you all don't mind. I'll ask it towards Amaris first, but Chloe, feel free to jump in. One of the questions I have is about storytelling as a young person. I know you all have the magazine, but how is like a standard program like able to take the stories of the young people and kind of amplify that?
I would say the first thing would be to always ask for permission, and to not put your own agenda into the work, which can be complicated at times when we feel like we have really good intentions. Because I know that when I was going through some submissions from young people, I was like, I kind of really want to tailor this a little bit more so I can repurpose it like for like our newsletter here. But I think, making sure that you're adequately like trained to work in storytelling is also really important. Like for me, I'm a freelance writer, but I don't freelance write with young people. So there was also the skill set that I had to, be able to develop. So I worked with the storytelling manager at my current position, and we worked together to kind of develop some ways to get authentic stories from young people, but to make sure that we're not exploiting their voice, because I think that there can be like a fine line between those two. So one thing that I would say is to always ask questions, listen to them. A lot of times I will work with young people and let them know, hey, I'm going to take some notes, compile it, and then let me know if you think this represents what you're telling me correctly. I think we have to, most definitely realize like any type of learning curve that we have with young people, because like as professionals, we have, very, nice writing skills. So I think it's just important to always ask for permission to make sure that you're telling that story correctly. And then when you are able to amplify that voice, to also always remember to just pass that mic to them. I think it's also more impactful when they're telling the story themselves.
Yes, so it's interesting you brought up storytelling, because I'm just kind of now diving into the storytelling work. So for the Teen Summit, one of our goals was to in what way can we make sure that their voices are heard, but also their stories are told? And so one of the sessions out of the 15 that we offered was a storytelling spoken word session. And then we also had smaller experiences while they were transitioning from session to session, where they were able to answer a question, a podcast question, and verbally give their answer or tell their story. And so we're still waiting to get those back. So I'm really interested to hear what the students had to say, but just giving them an opportunity to tell their story in different capacities where they feel comfortable and not in an exploitive fashion was really important for them. I mean, they were some of the most engaged sessions that we had, where they would just be able to tell their story and just say out loud some of the things that they're going through. And then to know that some of the other students in the room were going through similar things, and it was a regional event. So, students in Henrico are going through the same things as students in Chesterfield or Richmond. It was really empowering for them to be able to hear each other's stories. So maybe not just for us to be able to hear their stories, but for their peers to hear their stories, and to know that you're not alone, and to know that you have peer-to-peer support is extremely important.
This has been really, really great. Thank you both so very much. And I'm going to toss it over to Emma to close this out. Thank you both.
Yeah, as we finish up, I'm just going to drop a survey. Let us know anything you liked about the session, anything you'd want to change. We'll be having our Tackling Trauma Part 2 next month. So if you missed it last month, we have that on our YouTube, and I'll share it out in a follow-up email. And I'll also share out all of these resources, including the magazine and a couple of other leadership opportunities in the Richmond region as well. Cindy, do you have any final items to share?
No, that's it. The coffee hours next month on May 9th, and yeah.
Well, thank you, Amaris and Chloe. You guys have been great. I feel like the session has been really useful.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thanks, it was great talking to y'all.
Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of the day. Bye.